You bury a piece of dried meat in the ash of last night's fire, and somehow it doesn't rot. You watch your grandmother press moldy bread against a wound, and somehow the wound heals faster than the ones left uncovered. You notice that the women in your camp who sleep closest together start bleeding on the same days of the month. No one told you why. No one could have told you why. And yet you noticed. You remembered. You passed it on. For most of human history, there was no science to explain any of this. There was no germ theory, no microscope, no peer-reviewed journal. There was only pattern. Watch closely enough, for long enough, and something that looks like superstition starts looking like knowledge. This is a story about the beliefs your ancestors held that sounded absurd, that got mocked by later generations as primitive nonsense, magical thinking, folklore for people who didn't understand the world. And it turns out a surprising number of them were right. Not right by accident. Right, because someone, somewhere, thousands of years before writing existed, ran an experiment they didn't know was an experiment and kept the result. Let's start with the one that sounds the most like fantasy, the idea that mold could heal you. Across dozens of unconnected ancient cultures, healers reached for the same strange remedy when a wound festered. In ancient Egypt, physicians packed infected cuts with moldy bread. In parts of ancient China, practitioners applied moldy soybean curd to skin infections. In Serbia and Greece, moldy bread was tucked directly into open wounds, sometimes mixed with spider webs, which is its own story for later. To a modern reader, this sounds like exactly the kind of thing that should not work. Mold is what happens when something goes wrong. Mold is what you're supposed to throw away. But mold is also where Alexander Fleming found penicillin in 1928, when he noticed that a stray blob of penicillium mold on a forgotten petri dish had killed the bacteria growing around it. Fleming got the credit and the Nobel Prize. But he wasn't the first person to notice that fact. He was just the first person with the tools to explain why it was happening. Certain molds produce compounds that kill bacteria, because bacteria are their competition for food. Your ancestors couldn't have known that. They didn't have a word for bacteria. They didn't have a microscope. What they had was a wound, a piece of moldy bread, and the willingness to try it, watch it, and remember whether it worked. That's the pattern behind almost every belief on this list. Not blind superstition. Applied observation. Repeated across enough generations that it hardened into tradition. Then got written down by later cultures as an old wives' tale. A phrase that has quietly buried more accurate medical knowledge than almost any other in the English language. Here's the second one, and it's even stranger to say out loud. Menstrual cycles synchronize when women live in close proximity. This claim has a complicated modern history. A widely cited 1971 study by psychologist Martha M. McClintock proposed that women who spend a lot of time together, whether in dormitories or close-knit communities, start to align their cycles over a period of months, likely through subtle pheromonal signaling. Later research has pushed back on the size and consistency of this effect, and the modern scientific consensus is genuinely mixed. Some researchers argue the original data was statistically weak. Others have found supporting evidence in specific conditions. What's fascinating is not whether the modern debate is settled. It's that anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies, including the Jew/Honzi people of the Kalahari, studied extensively by anthropologist Richard Lee starting in the 1960s, found that women in these tight, mobile, communal groups already had a folk belief that their cycles moved together, long before any laboratory tried to measure it. Whether or not the biological mechanism is exactly what McClintock proposed, the observational instinct behind the belief that close human proximity changes close human biology was not naive. It was women paying extremely close attention to their own bodies and each other's over years in groups small enough that a shared pattern would actually be noticeable. That is not a lesser form of science. That is science with a much smaller sample size and no laboratory, run by people whose full attention wasn't fractured across 100 digital distractions. Now let's talk about dreams, because this is where things get genuinely uncomfortable for the modern mind. Ancient and traditional cultures across the world treated dreams as meaningful, not just emotionally meaningful. The way we might now say a dream reflects your anxiety. Literally meaningful. A message. A visit. A warning. The Australian Aboriginal concept often translated as the dreaming isn't really about sleep at all. It refers to a foundational, ongoing reality underlying the physical world. But the sleep dreams that human beings across dozens of unrelated cultures reported as prophetic, as visitations from the dead, as warnings about danger, weren't dismissed as noise. They were data. Modern sleep science, particularly research growing out of the discovery of REM sleep by Eugene Aserinsky and Nathaniel Kleitman in 1953, has shown that dreaming brains are doing something far more complex than random neural static. Dreaming appears to play a role in memory consolidation, emotional processing, and threat simulation. Some researchers, including psychologist Antti Revonsuo, have proposed what's called the threat simulation theory, that dreaming evolved specifically to let the brain rehearse dangerous scenarios in a low-cost, non-lethal environment. You dream about being chased because your ancestors' brains were quietly running fire drills for the exact predators, falls, and conflicts that could kill them the next day. That reframes an awful lot of ancient dream interpretation. A dream that felt like a warning about a snake wasn't mysticism. It may have been your nervous system flagging a genuine, recent, unprocessed sense of danger, something your waking mind hadn't consciously registered yet, but your amygdala clearly had. Ancient dream interpreters weren't reading tea leaves. They were running an early, intuitive form of threat assessment, using the only diagnostic tool available, the content of the dream itself. Let's reconstruct a scene, because this is easier to feel than to describe abstractly. You're asleep in a shelter 40,000 years ago. You dream of a shape moving at the edge of the firelight, low, fast, silent. You wake with your heart already pounding before your eyes are even open. In the morning, you tell the group. An elder nods slowly and says the dream was a warning. Move the camp back from the tree line. Nobody in that circle knows anything about REM sleep or threat simulation theory. But something in you had already noticed, subconsciously, the fresh paw prints near the water source, the alarm calls of a bird species 2 days earlier, the faint smell that didn't belong. Your sleeping brain assembled those unconscious observations into a story your waking mind could act on. The supernatural warning was your own senses, talking to you in the only language available at the time. Now, the twist. Not every ancient belief holds up. For every mold poultice that turns out to contain real antibiotic compounds, there are dozens of remedies, rituals, and taboos from the same era that modern science has found to be completely inert or actively harmful. Trepanation, the ancient practice of drilling holes into the skull to release evil spirits or built-up pressure, sometimes helped by coincidentally relieving actual swelling, and sometimes just killed the patient. Bloodletting persisted for over 2,000 years, from ancient Egypt through 19th century Europe, despite having essentially no basis in how the human body actually works, weakening the sick instead of healing them. So this isn't a story about ancient people secretly having modern knowledge. It's something more interesting than that. It's a story about a filtering process. Beliefs that were tested constantly, against real consequences, in real time, tended to survive if they worked and fade if they didn't. A healer whose remedies reliably killed patients did not get to pass down a large number of descendants trained in that method. Beliefs untethered from immediate, visible feedback, like the exact spiritual cause of an illness, had much more room to drift into pure fiction because nobody could check the work. The moldy bread got kept because the wound visibly healed faster. The specific spirit blamed for the wound in the first place got debated, embellished, and mythologized precisely because no one could ever check that part against reality. This brings us to Gobekli Tepe, a site in southeastern Turkey that rewired how archaeologists think about the order operations were supposed to happen in human history. For decades, the standard model was simple. Humans settled down, started farming, and only once they had stable food surpluses did they build monumental architecture and organized religion. Civilization was supposed to be the product of agriculture. Then, in the 1990s, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating Gobekli Tepe and found massive carved stone pillars, arranged in circular enclosures, dating back roughly 11,600 years, predating Stonehenge by about 6,000 years and predating any confirmed agriculture in the region. This was a ceremonial site, built by hunter-gatherers, before farming existed. That single discovery flips the old assumption on its head. It suggests that shared belief, ritual, and cooperative meaning-making might have come first, and that the organizational muscle built by gathering hundreds of people together for religious purposes might have been one of the very things that made farming, and eventually cities, possible in the first place. The primitive superstition wasn't a lesser stage before civilization. In at least one case we've now dug up, it may have been the engine that built it. Let's talk about ancestor beliefs next, because this one connects almost every culture on Earth despite having no possible way to coordinate with each other. Ancient Chinese ancestor veneration, West African traditions honoring departed elders, the Andean practice of keeping mummified ancestors present in daily life, Aboriginal Australian connections to ancestral beings, all of these independently arrived at the idea that the dead remain present, watching, judged by, and consulted through the living. Skeptics have long treated this as pure wish fulfillment, a comforting fiction to soften the fact of death. And grief certainly plays a role. But anthropologists studying these traditions, including work building on the foundational research of anthropologist Meyer, Fortas among the Talensi people of Ghana, found something more functional underneath the spiritual language. Ancestor belief systems consistently encode and enforce practical social rules. Don't take more than your share. Don't abandon your responsibilities. Respect the boundaries your family established. The ancestors are watching, which, in practice, means the community's accumulated wisdom about what causes conflict and starvation is watching, dressed up in a form vivid enough that people actually obey it. A rule stated as "don't overhunt near the river" is forgettable. A rule stated as "your grandfather's spirit will curse the hunting grounds if you take too much" is not. Ancient belief systems weren't just explaining the world. They were engineering compliance with rules that kept small, fragile communities alive, using the only enforcement mechanism available before written law: fear and reverence, powerful enough to outlast any individual's short-term temptation. Now for one that still makes modern doctors slightly uncomfortable to admit: the idea that a fever should be allowed to run. Traditional healers across many cultures treated fever not purely as an enemy to be crushed immediately, but as the body doing something purposeful, sweating out sickness, burning off the poison. For much of the 20th century, Western medicine treated this as backwards folk thinking. The correct move seemed to be to suppress fever immediately and aggressively. Modern immunology has walked that certainty back considerably. Research has shown that a moderate fever actually improves the function of several immune responses. Elevated body temperature can speed the activity of white blood cells and make it harder for certain pathogens to replicate efficiently. This doesn't mean every fever should be left completely untreated. Dangerously high fevers still carry real risk and need medical attention. But the reflexive instinct to eliminate all fever immediately has been meaningfully complicated by research into how the immune system actually uses heat as a weapon. Your ancestors watching a mild fever sweat out an illness weren't entirely wrong. They were watching the immune system's own strategy play out in real time and correctly concluding that fighting against it too hard might not help. Let's reconstruct one more scene because it ties several of these threads together. Picture a Neanderthal burial discovered at Shanidar Cave in what is now Iraqi Kurdistan, excavated starting in the 1950s by archaeologist Ralph Selekai. Around one skeleton, soil samples revealed unusually high concentrations of pollen from several flowering plants, some of which have documented traditional medicinal uses. Selekai's original interpretation, that this represented a deliberate flower burial, a Neanderthal funeral with floral offerings, became one of the most famous and most contested claims in paleoanthropology. Later researchers proposed the pollen might have been introduced by burrowing rodents rather than deliberate human placement, and the debate continues today. But here's what's striking, regardless of which interpretation eventually wins. The debate itself is only possible because we now take seriously the idea that a Neanderthal, a species we spent over a century calling brutish and subhuman, might have had ritual, grief, and medicinal plant knowledge sophisticated enough to gather flowers with healing properties and place them around a dead companion. 50 years ago, that possibility would have been laughed out of the room. Now it's a live scientific question, argued in respected journals, precisely because so many other primitive behaviors keep turning out to have real functional depth underneath them. So where does that leave the big counterintuitive twist of this whole story? It's this. The line we draw between ancient superstition and scientific knowledge is much blurrier and much more recent than most people assume. For the overwhelming majority of human history, careful observation and cultural memory were the only research tools available, and they worked far better than we've historically given them credit for. The failure wasn't in the method. Watching closely, testing repeatedly, and passing down what worked is, in essence, the scientific method, just running without laboratories, statistics, or peer review. The failure was in the explanation layer wrapped around the observation, the spirits, the curses, the specific mythological cause assigned to a real, correctly identified effect. Strip away the explanation and the underlying behavior, don't overhunt, Treat this wound with that mold, respect a fever's work, take dreams seriously as information, was frequently sound. Which brings this back to you, because you are doing the exact same thing right now, whether you notice it or not. You have folk beliefs of your own, quietly running in the background of your life, that you've never once tested against a controlled study. You know which friends' texts mean trouble before you open them. You know your body is getting sick a full day before any symptom appears, some small heaviness you can't quite name. You know a room feels wrong the second you walk into it, before anything visibly confirms why. None of that is magic. It's the same pattern recognition machine your ancestors were running, quietly cross-referencing thousands of tiny signals faster than your conscious mind can narrate them. Think about how much of your own daily behavior you could not actually justify with a citation if someone demanded one. You avoid a certain food because it didn't sit right once, years ago, and some part of you never forgot. You trust a particular person's judgment on instinct, long before you could list the specific reasons why. You feel uneasy walking down a street at a certain hour, not because you've read the crime statistics, but because something in your body has quietly cross-referenced posture, lighting, and silence, and returned a verdict faster than your conscious mind could explain it. None of this makes you primitive. It makes you exactly what your ancestors were. A pattern recognition system running on partial information, doing the best it can, and getting quietly, remarkably good at it over time. The difference between you and the healer packing a wound with moldy bread 40,000 years ago isn't that you have replaced instinct with knowledge. It's that you now have both, layered on top of each other, and you rarely notice which one is doing the work in any given moment. When a doctor's gut tells them something is wrong before the test results confirm it, that's the same ancient machinery, just running inside someone with a medical degree instead of a healer with an oral tradition. When a new parent wakes up seconds before their child actually cries, with no baby monitor, no sound, nothing they could point to, that isn't a coincidence they got lucky on once. That's the same faculty your ancestors were relying on when they woke at the exact right moment to notice movement at the edge of the firelight. The moldy bread, the shared cycles, the prophetic dreams, the fevers left to run their course, the ancestors watching from just beyond the firelight. None of it required a single microscope. It required only what every human brain has always had: the discipline to notice, the patience to remember, and just enough humility to keep doing what worked, long after anyone could fully explain why. Modern science didn't replace that instinct. It gave it a vocabulary. It took a story about spirits and evil and blessing and translated it into a story about bacteria, minerals, immune cells, and gravity, without changing the underlying behavior nearly as much as most people assume. The rituals looked different. The results, disturbingly often, did not. You wake up when your body is ready. No alarm, no schedule, no one to tell you it's time. But somewhere underneath that ordinary morning, 100,000 years of quiet observation are still running, whether you ever thought to call it science or not.